Very good to have here today Neal, who's a colleague of mine in the economics department here at the University of Chicago. Our discussion today is going to be largely about education, although we may touch on a few of other things Derek's worked on over the years, some of his experiences here at Chicago. But I know you have a book coming out, or hopefully coming out soon. I think it's under review at the moment, is what you told me last. It's a book on education and education policy. What are the key issues you cover in your book, and what are the key issues you think an economist can really help us understand a little better about education?
If you look at any activity other than education where the government buys or sells something, there are usually a bunch of economists around advising the government agency on the right mechanism, or there's a large economics literature on the right mechanism to use to either run an auction or to write the contract correctly, et cetera. In education, the role of economists in terms of K through 12 education policy has usually been to allow somebody from an ed school or a sociology department to design the system, and then we show up ex post and say, well, we know more statistics, let us evaluate the new system.
What do you mean by a system?
So, take No Child Left Behind, for example. That was an idea that a way to get better performance out of government-funded schools was to create a bunch of statistics based on student test scores and then create a system of penalties for schools that perform poorly according to that set of statistics.
Okay, so let me make clear how this system was set up. We were going to have school instruction provided the same way it has been. Local school districts teaching students whatever curriculum they choose, using the teachers that get hired in their system. And we were going to have the federal government evaluate the local school.
The federal government forced the state governments to evaluate the local schools.
The government said, hey, we need to make these schools accountable.
Right.
And that accountability is a great buzzword in education.
Right.
I think what people mean is we want there to be consequences, good consequences if you perform well, bad consequences if you perform poorly. And they'll say, well, geez, that's what your economists tell us all the time. We have to give people incentives. So the way we're going to incentivize the local schools to provide high quality education is, by God, we're going to evaluate them.
And threaten them with reorganization, sanctions, et cetera, if they don't meet the performance targets that we lay out in this statistical system.
Okay, so we're going to set some targets. We're going to say you have to do X. Presumably X is some way of trying to get you to provide a good education. We're then going to measure whether you did X, and then we're going to have consequences. We're going to pat you at the back in some way or give you some resources or benefits if you do well, and maybe we're going to kick you in the behind if you don't do so well.
Right.
That we're going to do something, and maybe that's close you down, maybe that's reorganize you, make your life miserable in some way, but we're going to have some consequences for doing poorly.
One of the key points of my book and of my research over the last 5 to 10 years is that every detail about that system was a detail that if you went across the street to your colleagues in the business school that teach contracts or personnel or organizational economics, and you said, what do you think about using this set of statistics with this set of consequences to direct the actions of the teachers? They would have said ex ante, this is a bad idea. That these systems are set up in a way that they're going to invite gaming activities that are going to be harmful for the kids. They're set up in a way so that ex post, the measurements aren't going to mean what they were intended to mean. And this is going to be a disaster on many dimensions. And so the way things worked was, people in ed schools and people who weren't really thinking about what economists have learned about designing incentive systems and designing contracts, et cetera, put this obviously flawed system in place. And then for 10 years after, economists came along and wrote papers about how it had all these unintended consequences. And I'm trying with this book to say, let's think from first principles, not only about if we're going to have assessment-based accountability, what economics says would be the smart way to do it, but let's think about what economics tells us about the smart way to do school assignment, the smartest ways to do vouchers or charters, et cetera, how to design a whole system of using publicly funded money to get the best education you can for children by incorporating choice and accountability, but in ways that make sense given what people in other areas of economics have learned about contracting, performance monitoring, competition between suppliers, et cetera.
Let me push back a little bit, because it's not just that there's an easy solution and these guys are doing it wrong. In fact, economists and labor economists in particular have long recognized that having these kind of formal evaluation systems are very difficult, not easy thing to do. That is, people always want to game the system, and it doesn't matter whether I'm working on an assembly line or whether I'm a salesman. Designing an effective incentive system isn't the easiest thing to do in general. It's even harder the further away I am from the problem, and the more I have to just write it down in some formal structure. In fact, I think a lot of people that we teach in the business school, we would say, maybe you should try to avoid these kind of systems and really go to a much more informal supervisor evaluation system, something that doesn't smell like, here's the hard criteria, let's, run with that.
Okay, so as usual, we agree completely. Okay? And I must have spoke poorly. What I was trying to say was, if you take one of these classes, say from Canis, Prendergast in the business school, Canis will spend the whole quarter telling you two things. Empirically, very few people in the private sector work in a situation where they have a lot of their pay determined by some formula. And he will say, well, why is that? And then he'll spend the rest of the quarter explaining how things can go terribly wrong when you try to determine employment and compensation by simple formulas or even complicated formulas.
I mean, I always tell people, you get what you pay for, not necessarily what you want.
Right.
So if you
and there's a literature in sociology called Campbell's Law. In management, it's called the folly of paying for A while hoping for B. In economics, it's called the multitasking problem, and people associate it with Holmstrom and Milgram. But a bunch of different fields have rediscovered the same thing. It's very hard to direct action on complicated, sophisticated jobs using formulas. What I was trying to say is that No Child Left Behind was not even a sophisticated attempt to use formulas. They were kind of simple, stupid rules of thumb that were obviously going to be gained. And so I'm not in favor of trying to push that approach. I'm saying they didn't even make a good effort if they were going to go down that road.
Yeah, so to be clear, that's what I was trying to say, is that there really were two problems here. You have an incredibly difficult problem. If this is the only option you have, is to set up this formal evaluation system with simple formulas, incredibly difficult problem. Poorly executing a very difficult problem is unlikely to lead to a good outcome.
Right.
And I think what you were saying is, not surprisingly, we didn't get good outcomes in those circumstances.
Right.